Hello photographers, today we're going to talk about auto ISO, starting with what the heck is auto ISO. And it is exactly what it sounds like. Auto ISO is a function on your camera that allows you to let the camera automatically set your ISO setting for you. So first off is enabling auto ISO, and this will vary from camera to camera. But generally speaking, you'll go into your ISO setting and the auto option will be right there. If it's not there, you'll need to go into your menu system to find it. Your camera will be different, so don't look for these exact same settings, but do look in your menu system for the auto ISO option, because not only will you activate it, but you will set the parameters. And the parameters are what's really important, because with auto ISO, you're giving the camera control of your ISO function. Now, every camera has a different minimum and maximum ISO range, but within that range, you as a photographer will have an upper limit that you are going to be happy with using your camera. I am of the opinion that you shoot at the ISO you need, no matter how high it is. But other people are of the opinion that maybe you never go over, say, ISO 1600 if you're using maybe a micro four thirds camera. It is entirely up to you to decide that. But whatever that limit is, you're going to want to set your auto ISO so that it has an upper limit. This dictates the working range that the auto ISO can use. It will not go lower than the lowest ISO you set, and it will not go higher than the highest ISO you set. Outside of that range, you still may find yourself in situations where the auto ISO cannot compensate for the aperture or shutter speed that you have set. And what that means is, even though you may use the auto ISO function, you still need to pay attention to your camera's exposure value and whether it's giving you an indicator that it's going to be under or overexposed because you've chosen an aperture or a shutter speed that can't be managed by the ISO range you've set. So once you've set your limits, now it's about what does auto ISO do in the different modes on your camera. Now, we all already know that when you're in full auto, the camera will set everything for you. It's going to set ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. You don't have control over anything. We're not talking about that. We're talking about either program auto, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual mode. And we're going to start with program auto. In program auto, you as the photographer have control over the ISO function. The camera will set the aperture and the shutter speed for you. If you activate auto ISO while using program auto, then what will happen is the camera will set the ISO, aperture, and the shutter speed for you. But this is different from full auto mode, because in full auto mode, you have no control over anything other than clicking the button to take a picture. But in program auto mode, you can still control the overall exposure through the exposure compensation function. Now, in the priority modes, it's quite similar, except in the priority modes, you as the photographer still retain control over one of the settings. Normally, when you're using aperture or shutter priority, you as the photographer control the main setting. So let's just say aperture priority. You control aperture, you also control ISO, and then the camera sets the shutter speed for you to balance it out to a zero exposure. And then if you want to adjust the exposure, you use the exposure compensation to make it brighter or darker. Well, if you enable auto ISO in aperture priority mode, then you have control over the aperture. The camera has control over the shutter speed and the ISO. And what that means is if you adjust the exposure compensation, then the camera can still change the shutter speed and the ISO function in order to balance the exposure and bring it to where you want it to be. Now we get to manual mode. And if you enable auto ISO in manual mode, what the camera will do is allow you to set the aperture and the shutter speed, and then it will automatically change the ISO to balance out the exposure. And just like in program auto and the priority modes, when in manual mode, if you want to make the image brighter or darker, and if you are using auto ISO, you can then use the exposure compensation function to increase or decrease the exposure, directing the camera to change the function that it controls, which in this case is the ISO, to over or underexpose the image as you desire. And this is where people get most confused, because in manual mode, you have this exposure compensation function. And if you retain control over all of the settings, the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, then the exposure compensation does nothing while shooting in manual mode. Exposure compensation will only work in manual mode if you have auto ISO activated. Otherwise, in manual mode, you as the photographer do exposure compensation by changing one of your 3 settings to over or underexpose your image. So the final thing to think about with auto ISO is, how do you use the auto ISO function? When or why would you use the auto ISO function? And really that comes down to your choice as a photographer. I personally never use auto ISO. Now when I say that, I am not saying auto ISO is bad. I'm not saying you shouldn't use it. I'm just saying for that my photography, auto ISO doesn't make any sense, because I shoot in a studio environment with lighting that I control that doesn't vary unless I change it. And what that means is I want my camera settings to always be the same so that I know the results that I'm going to get every single shot that I take. But let's say you're shooting sports in a variable lighting environment, like maybe soccer or football outside. This is a case where auto ISO could be helpful for you, because things are going to be moving quickly and you may not have time to fiddle with your ISO or one of your other settings in order to bring the exposure in line where you want it. If you enable auto ISO, you can let the camera do the work for you, but still manage your exposure with exposure compensation. And that allows you to shoot faster and capture the images you need to capture and take the worry out of making sure your exposure is where you want it. What I would suggest you do is experiment with auto ISO. Figure out where it fits into your shooting style and your shooting environments, and then use it when it suits your needs. If you want to learn more about exactly how ISO works, you should check this video out right here, because it explains everything you need to know to really understand the ISO function on your camera. Now, what are you still doing watching this video? Get out there and take some damn photos.